My name's Anne Gardiner. I'm a principal consultant in the Climate Policy and Strategy business area at Ecofys. I have more than 20 years experience in consultancy on energy and climate policy, and I'm overall responsible for our work on non-state initiatives. I'll be joined in this presentation by Michelle Bosquet, who is a consultant in the same business area, focusing on the evaluation of mitigation interventions and development of low carbon scenarios. She was a core member of the project team for the Wedging the Gap project, which is what I'm talking about today. We're talking about today. So the title of our presentation is Better Partnerships, Private Sector-Led Climate Action. As mentioned, this was carried out in collaboration with the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership and was supported by the German government. Oh, sorry. I'm sure you all know that government pledges on greenhouse gas emission reductions are not yet sufficient to meet the 2 degrees pathway. The diagram on the left shows the position as it was in 2011, but even recent developments haven't changed the overall picture, particularly for 2020, very much. It shows, the picture on the left shows global greenhouse gas emissions in different scenarios. So dark blue is business as usual, light blue a range of pledges made by government, and green the pathway needed to meet 2 degrees C as a maximum temperature rise. You can see there's a big gap even between the pledges and the 2 degrees pathway, let alone compared to the business as usual. And as I mentioned, even with the INDCs, the position for 2020 hasn't changed significantly. But over the next 30 minutes, you'll learn about actions that are going on now, not driven by governments, but taken bottom up by different actors that have the potential to close this gap. And these aren't theoretical actions, but the ones that are delivering emission reductions in the short term. In this presentation, you'll hear about what their impact might be, what makes them successful, and ideas about how they might be scaled up. These initiatives fit into the concept of wedging the gap which we developed, which is shown on the right of this diagram, which basically looks at practical actions that can be taken by anyone or by different organisations to fill the gap between what the governments have pledged and what is needed for 2 degrees C. In particular, in the presentation, you'll hear about how international cooperative initiatives have been growing, what our project says about 5 private sector cooperative initiatives in detail, and what we found from engagement with those initiatives about scaling them up. This figure comes from a database we've developed, which now contains more than 200 international cooperative initiatives. By now, you're probably wondering what I mean by international cooperative initiatives, so I'll explain a little bit here. What we include in our database and what we count as international cooperative initiatives are actions that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are driven by non-government, non-central or national level government actors, and that involve two or more parties that aren't directly linked. So, for example, if you had 2 or 3 companies coming together to reduce emissions from a particular process, that would be counted as a cooperative initiative. But if a company is trying to reduce emissions along its own supply chain, that wouldn't be counted as initiative. In our definition, there are other definitions that are used in other platforms, but this is the one that we would use. What that doesn't mean is that it doesn't mean, although we're saying its drivers are non-governmental, it doesn't mean governments can't be involved. In fact, there's some evidence that actually initiatives are more successful if there is government involvement, but really that the driving force for any action is non-governmental. This figure shows the number of initiatives in different sectors, and you can see there's quite a lot of initiatives in a few sectors and others have rather fewer. Of course, some of the initiatives are more active than others, and as you will see in the next slide. So as well as the project which I'm describing today, or which we're describing today, we carried out another project for UNEP in which we quantified the emission reduction impacts of all initiatives in 2020. I won't go into the details here because this isn't the main point of this presentation, but I'm sure you can imagine that methodologically it is relatively difficult to calculate these emission reductions because you have all sorts of different types of initiatives. However, we did make the attempt and we came up with a number which was presented earlier this year in Bonn, and it was for UNEP, as I mentioned. And the combined impact of all these initiatives is about 3 gigatons of CO2, with quite a wide uncertainty range because of the difficulties with the methodology and data uncertainties as well. Now that's the combined impact without taking into account the overlap between that and government pledges. But we calculated that at the moment, though, that overlap is relatively limited. And this figure of 3 gigatons is obviously significant when you look at the gap that we saw previously. The biggest contributions were from cities and regions, but companies also were significant. And that's one of the reasons why we chose to look at private sector initiatives in more detail. Those of you who remember the previous slide will spot that actually there's little correlation between the number of initiatives in a sector and the emission reductions. And that's because many of the initiatives don't have quantitative targets or concrete actions. Sorry, I can see that there's somebody's having a problem with the audio.
It's okay, and you can go ahead.
Okay. Yeah.
This is just local internet connection issue, but we are receiving properly. You can go ahead.
Okay. Good. Okay. So, to understand the impact of the initiative, we evaluated 5 in some detail. We performed quantitative analysis and also interviews and workshops with the initiatives themselves and with other stakeholders. For the quantitative analysis, we used 3 scenarios. We used the current target scenario, in which obviously, as it implies, all members, the members have the targets that they've already committed to. Used the scale-up scenario, where all members either followed the example of leading members within an initiative, or there was a modest increase in membership. And then we looked also at the available potential, where you had similar actions by the entire sector. So far, you've heard about the background to the project, what we mean by cooperative initiatives, and the approach we use. In the next few slides, we'll talk in more detail about the quantitative piece and the results from that. I will do the next introductory slide, and then Michelle will talk you through the details. So the first thing that's needed is a way of choosing those 5 initiatives out of the 200 initiatives that we started with. The first filter was to really look at whether there was a long-term private sector commitment. So was there private sector involvement, and has the initiative been going for at least 2 or 3 years? So there were a lot of initiatives. A lot of initiatives started in New York last year, but we judged those didn't have yet a long track record, so those were not included. That first filter reduced the 200 to 44 initiatives. The second filter we used was that we wanted a degree of leadership, visibility and prominence in the initiatives themselves. And particularly we wanted a degree of private sector leadership. And that filter reduced the selection to 14 initiatives. Out of those 14 initiatives, we then looked to balance out different types of initiative and different sectors, as well as choosing ones where we thought they would have a high impact or ambition level, but also more pragmatically where there was data availability. And those 5 initiatives were the ones that we chose to do the analysis on. And Michelle will now talk you through the details. Over to you, Michelle.
Thank you, Anne. As Anne has mentioned, we've been actively examining the contribution of cooperative initiatives from a high-level overarching perspective. But for this new piece of analysis, we really wanted to have a closer look at specific initiatives to do a deep dive analysis to understand their impact. The impact they're currently having, as well as the impact that they could have if they were appropriately scaled or supported in the right way. I would like to now show you how this impact in terms of emission reductions can be determined. For our 5 case studies, we aimed at getting a broad representation of initiatives as they are found in the private sector space. So we had a look at sector-specific initiatives represented by the Cement Sustainability Initiative that promotes sustainable development in the cement industry. Refrigerants Naturally that aims at shifting the refrigeration use from F-gases towards natural refrigerants in point-of-sales refrigeration. And then as an example of cross-sectoral initiatives, we looked at WWF's Climate Savers, where companies active in different sectors come together to set reduction targets for their operational carbon footprints, as well as demonstrate leadership within their field. And finally, we looked at initiatives that are issue-focused, like the Tropical Forest Alliance 2020, a public-private partnership working on achieving net zero tropical deforestation by 2020 by targeting the key commodities palm oil, soy, beef, paper, and pulp. And UNEP's Enlighten, which goal is the phase-out of inefficient lamps worldwide and is actively supporting specifically developing countries on their path towards transition. So how does one determine the impact of an initiative in terms of its emission reductions? And as Anne has already mentioned, this can be tricky. So I provide you here with a simplified overview of how we determined the impact. So basically for each initiative, we looked at the individual members, the year they committed to the initiative's target, as well as the development of their actual emissions. Based on historic emission trends and sector-specific projections for the future, we developed a business-as-usual pathway for each member's emissions had they not joined the initiative. The impact is then the difference between emissions under business as usual and the emissions when the set target through the initiative is achieved in 2020. For each initiative, we also had a look at how many members are likely to reach the target that is set to make sure we have an actual representation for our current scenario, current target scenario. So let's have a look at the different impacts of our initiative. Starting with the Cement Sustainability Initiative, which I will refer to as CSI. Under CSI, currently only 11 members have adopted emission intensity targets reductions for 2020. If these targets are reached, 100 megatons of CO2 can be avoided by the initiative under the current target scenario. If the initiative is now scaled, which means here we assume that all 25 members adopt the same level of emission, 160 megatons of avoided emissions can be achieved by 2020. Taking this even a step further and looking at the available potential, so what would happen if the entire cement sector would follow the example of these ambitious emission intensity targets, overall 540 megatons of CO2 emissions could be avoided. Next up is Enlighten. As I've mentioned, currently Enlighten is engaged with 73 member countries to phase out inefficient lighting. 39 of these countries have already committed themselves to ban the sale of this inefficient lighting options before 2020. Taken together, this market transition already can achieve up to 60 megatons of emission savings by 2020. If now all currently participating countries would follow the example and ban incandescent lighting by 2016, 80 megatons of CO2 emissions could be avoided in 2020. And overall, looking at the potential within the lighting sector, we find that if the entire world would switch to efficient lighting options, 640 megatons of CO2 could be avoided in 2020, with 340 of these coming from developing countries. Talking about the Tropical Forest Alliance, which I refer to as TFA, we specifically looked at palm oil, as this is the first commodity targeted by the initiative. Currently, we have 16 private sector members engaged in this public-private partnership, with 8 of them having set specific goals of zero deforestation connected to the palm oil that they're currently handling within their supply chains. If these 8 members were to source their palm oil sustainably, 20 megatons of CO2 emissions reductions could be achieved by 2020. scaling this initiative up, so having all private sector companies phase out their palm oil and handling it completely sustainably, thereby avoiding the push into new virgin or high carbon content forests, 200 megatons of CO2 emissions could be avoided in 2020. This number can be even increased if we look at the entire palm oil production sector, where if entire currently produced palm oil were sourced sustainably in 2020, 460 megatons of CO2 could be avoided. For climate savers, the approach was a little bit differently, as the current members already have set emission reduction targets, and a requirement within the initiative is to reach your target to remain in the initiative. So under current target scenarios, 32 megatons of CO2 can be avoided in 2020 by climate savers companies. As the scale-up option, we looked at the specific companies currently active in climate savers and others that might be interesting in size and visibility or prominence for the initiative to join, and applied similar targets for these companies. This would then result in over 60 megatons of CO2 emissions avoided in 2020. Under the available potential scenario, we looked at the different sectors that are represented within climate savers and looked at what would happen if these industry peers would follow the lead of climate savers member companies. Then up to 1,300 megatons of CO2 could be avoided by 2020. And finally, refrigerants naturally. Here we also have a different look at our approach, as most of the emissions from refrigeration units come from at the end of life of the refrigeration unit when it's dismantled. So instead of impact in 2020, for this initiative we looked at 2030. Currently, for companies and refrigerants naturally, if all the refrigeration units from these companies were replaced with natural refrigerants, we would get 1.4 megatons of CO2 emissions avoided in 2030. Under the scale-up scenario, we looked at what would happen if all standalone refrigeration units were to follow this lead and use natural refrigerants. Then up to 8 megatons of CO2 emissions to be avoided by 2030. And as available potential, we looked at the entire refrigeration sector. So replacing F-gas-based refrigerants with natural ones for all refrigeration units, including domestic refrigeration, but also condensing units and full supermarket systems, could potentially result in 320 megatons of avoided emissions in the year 2030. So overall, we've seen that there's quite a potential lying within these initiatives. Under the current scenario, all 5 initiatives taken together can achieve up to 200 megatons of avoided emissions already now in 2020. Under the scale-up scenario, where the initiatives increase their emissions within their membership or slightly increase membership, over 500 megatons of CO2 emissions could be saved in a year. Under the available potential, we see that these 5 initiatives touch on important sectors, and overall 2.9 gigatons of CO2 emissions could be avoided if all these sectors were to follow the lead of the emissions lead of the initiative members. And now, back to you, Anne.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. I think we were having some problems with the sound quality there, but I hope everybody could hear the final parts of the presentation, and I hope mine is slightly better. So now you know about why we're doing this project and what the initiatives might contribute in the short term. But you saw in one of the first slides that the scale of emission reductions needed is still large, And therefore it's important that we learn what we can about how to scale up these initiatives, and also, incidentally, how to use these initiatives to spur more ambition spur more ambition in governments by demonstrating what's possible. So in this part of the project, which was led by CISL, the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, and comprised interviews with initiatives and also workshops with initiatives and other stakeholders, we looked a bit more about the sort of motivating factors and also issues around governance and opportunities for improving opportunities for scaling up the initiatives. So an important element for scaling up is to understand what motivates the private sector to join or form initiatives, and what are the opportunities they see. Very often the main motivations are not directly greenhouse gas related, but because of many other benefits that come from these initiatives. Although there are significant differences, some common motivations include cost efficiencies and savings, image, and anticipating or even driving policy and regulation to stay ahead of the game. Each initiative has very different membership with different motivations and governance structures, as I mentioned. For example, Enlighten was motivated by the opportunity for Osram and Philips to sell higher margin products and governments to gain energy savings. While WWF Climate Savers was driven by developed countries to be seen as climate leaders, with the additional benefit of being associated with the WWF brand. And in terms of governance, the Cement Sustainability Initiative, Refrigerants Naturally, are full private sector-led initiatives, as we mentioned before, whereas Climate Savers is an NGO-led initiative, and the Tropic, called Forest Alliance and Enlighten, are public-private partnerships, with governments and businesses working closely together. Interestingly, despite these differences, some of them have barriers and opportunities in common. So, for example, the opportunity was often seen of getting more company involvement and ownership of a problem, of actually influencing policy, as well as making technological advancements. But to overcome the barriers and to make the most of the motivating factors and opportunities, it was necessary to actually push for better, more ambitious partner strategy through tailoring that strategy to the form of the initiative. If we unpick governance structure a bit more, most of the initiatives have some kind of secretariat, and depending on the size and the setup, it could be a small secretariat or something rather bigger, and sometimes it's made up of members of the private sector companies, and sometimes it's an external type body. The Secretariat has an important role as convener, facilitator, clearinghouse, but they can also act as honest brokers. So to ensure that the initiatives can achieve their objectives, without sharing of data between the participants that could give anyone a competitive advantage. Private sector ownership in some cases often drives the issue forward. But government engagement is also needed to pave the way, but too much government engagement can be seen as a stifling innovation. So there's a balancing act to be done there. As I mentioned before, As mentioned before, there is a question about the degree of overlap with government pledges. Ultimately, of course, all abatement happens in a country, and there's therefore counted to their emissions and any measurement against the targets. But the nature of these initiatives can actually drive abatement at least earlier and possibly even over and above, or certainly over and above, current government ambitions. So they can reach across borders where there is no no policy now, and they can increase ambition beyond policy. And Climate Savers and the Cement Sustainability Index are good examples here, where they're bringing the standards to companies in countries where there isn't the policy at the moment. And some initiatives can catalyze policy action, and an Enlighten is the example here. And an important factor in the achievement of aims and the ambition is the dynamic nature of an initiative. Most initiatives will have leaders and laggards, and this dynamic nature can be an important factor in scaling up. So when considering scaling up, how those leaders and laggards work together. And of course, individual ambition can be greater than the government ambition, and by coming together as an initiative, that strengthens that individual ambition. So thinking about governance and motivations, it can be a good way to spur ambition, but also pose some risks. So they can reduce policy risk, particularly if you then use that to actually influence policy discussions. They can also be a barrier to joining, though. And of course, if you fail, because not everybody will want to sign up to a particular target. And of course, if you fail to meet the targets, then this could be bad for business, at least for business reputation. So taking the lessons from the project, we've come up with an action plan to scale up private sector initiatives. The initiatives themselves should set clear goals, monitor action and report on that action. They should also increase ambition and membership, although there can be tensions here as more ambitious goals may actually discourage some companies from joining. Finally, collaboration across sectors and good communication can help sharing best practice. Although, as I mentioned before, there are differences between the governance of the initiatives. In our workshops, we found that there was enough areas of common interest to really make exchange of knowledge valuable. On the other side, stakeholders, particularly governments, should include the effective initiatives in climate strategies, recognizing that they deliver both emission reductions and other benefits. They could also support them to increase impact For example, through providing resources and finances to increase membership. Finally, they need to recognise the bottom-up nature and create supportive rather than prescriptive structures in order to avoid particularly the stifling of innovation. Over the last 40 minutes, you've heard about why initiatives are important, what they might deliver, and remember we're talking about quite high emission reductions, potential emission reductions from even these 5 initiatives, and how they might be scaled up. To connect again to the bigger picture, cooperative initiatives can increase mitigation ambition, not only amongst themselves but also in governments and other, and stimulate other actions. But in a lot of cases, their achievements and names are not well enough known to do this yet. But there's a growing interest from governments and companies themselves, which would lead to, it's likely to lead to a more thorough assessment. There's also much discussion about how or even if they should be recognised in the international negotiations under the UNFCCC. The Lima Paris Action Agenda, driven by French and Peruvian governments, and the NASCAR portal of the UNFCCC have served to showcase bottom-up initiatives, and there are thematic days planned for Paris in this area. But there's some uncertainty about what happens after Paris, what's the next stage. Everyone recognises that this is an important area, but then how to keep that engagement. And the kind of analysis that we did here can help raise the profile of initiatives, but also make the kind of connections that can have a transformative effect in sectors. So I hope you now all see the importance of initiatives. And if anyone is interested in engaging with initiatives or even setting up their own initiatives, please get in touch with us, and we'd love to help you be part of the groundswell of bottom-up action.